Hello everybody, this is Nahaz. With the school year over, I figured it was time to revisit one of my other video series here. This is Esports Economist. The idea is to bring you guys focus on some other content beyond just statistics and possibly beyond just Dota 2. This is not the video that I thought I was going to be making tonight. I had some plans to record a TI qualifiers vid for you guys. But Valve posted a major announcement this afternoon, and I wanted to weigh in with some of my thoughts. The content of this announcement was that for the next year, so starting beyond TI7, we are going to have a major change to the way the Dota 2 professional scene is going to be run, especially at the top end. The era of Valve-run majors is over. There are now going to be two tiers of tournaments labeled both majors and minors by Valve, and no longer will there be a flat $3 million prize pool for Valve-run events. Instead, Valve is going to be partnering with third-party tournament organizers. The idea is that majors, qualified major tournaments, are going to be minimum $500,000 prize pool events, and Valve is going to contribute an additional $500,000 on top. Minors are going to be minimum $150,000 of events with an additional $150,000 provided by Valve. So expect that $300,000 and $1 million are going to be the two most common prize pools. Just doing the math, one would also expect that there are probably going to be more frequent events. So instead of just the two or three $3 million majors, you might see as many as 4 or 5 $1 million majors, and hopefully supported by a number of smaller tournaments as well. There's not much specifically spelled out in this additional blog entry, but there are some requirements given. Valve has stipulated in its initial post that both types of tournaments must have, number one, at least one qualifier from each of the 6 regions. So North America, South America, SEA, China, EU, and CIS all have to be represented with at least one qualifier slot each. There is no stipulation on the format of these qualifiers, so they can be run in several different ways. We'll get back to that later. It's also stipulated that any tournament for which Valve is going to match for the prize pool like this has to have a LAN finals component, so at least the final matches have to be played on LAN. And again, there's no specified format for this either. So what I'm hoping is we might get a little bit more variety in some of the tournaments that we've seen. But again, we'll get to see this later. The big change, other than Valve matching the prize pool instead of providing $3 million flat, is going to be qualifying points. So rather than invites to Valve-run majors being decided rather arbitrarily, we are going to have a running tally of qualifying points being awarded throughout the year that are going to contribute to a team earning its way into TI. What is said in the blog is that majors are going to provide more prize points, not only more points, but more points per prize pool dollar. So there is going to be a non-linear scaling. Majors have to have at least just over 3 times the minimum prize pool, but they could be worth, say, 5 times or more the points compared to minors. This is probably a good thing. We all want the biggest tournaments to have the most impact in deciding bids to the international. The other major thing that was spelled out is that points are going to accrue to individual players, not teams. So roster lock periods are still going to occur, but the difference is that players that change teams during one of these roster lock periods will keep the points that they have earned by placing or winning at previous tournaments. So there's now hopefully going to be a lot more mobility. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about as we go on that was not spelled out is what the penalty is going to be for violating the roster lock period. So if you do have a roster change outside of the lock period, is it just that player that loses his qualifying points? Is the entire team penalized in terms of its qualifying points or its eligibility to participate in the different events? The other thing is, It is suggested, if you read the blog, that these qualifying points are going to count for TI only. It is not spelled out whether individual qualifying points or team qualifying points will have an influence in determining the identity of teams competing at the next major. So things are going to be a lot less immediate. It's going to be a much more long-term process, at least ostensibly, where we're going to see teams earning points throughout the year trying to get into TI instead of just this crazy bout of lands having a huge influence only on the bids to the next major. That's going to be nice. It's going to give us a little bit more continuity. There are some concerns, though, that I have that we'll talk about going on. So why this change? This is something, if you're not familiar with Dota 2, if you're coming from the outside of the scene looking in, this is something that a lot of us that follow the scene have really asked for, have pushed for in the last couple seasons. And I think the overarching reaction today, there's still a lot of uncertainty, but the overarching reaction today for most people that follow Dota 2 is a great deal of satisfaction. We're very optimistic about this new system. Valve Run major tournaments have just dominated the landscape for the last 2 years since TI5 when the major system was first introduced. You can see I've pulled, this is data mostly from Liquipedia on premium and professional tab tournaments. So again, there's no hard prize pool cutoffs for premium and professional, and in fact, we'll actually look at a little bit different ways of defining these events as we go on, but these are tournaments that were advertised as premium or professional tournaments in the client, and you can see both the frequency, the big fall off in terms of the frequency of these events after TI5. We went from 55 and 49 to only 40 and 37 in the last couple of years between TIs. As well as, this is something that was a little concerning, the actual average prize pool declined for the non-Valve events post TI6 compared to TI5 to TI6. Now, this is there's a little bit of subjectivity that I used in making these plots. I excluded DAC 2015 with its nearly $3 million prize pool. That was kind of viewed, at least after the fact, it was kind of viewed as the prototype for the majors. It was viewed as, technically it wasn't a Valve run event, but it was Perfect World and Valve had a great deal of say. So I think a lot of people group that as sort of a pre-major. I've also excluded WESG, which was a little bit of a different, it was a $1.5 million tournament held this past winter. It was a little bit different because of its format. Only teams that had 5 players of the same nationality were allowed to compete. So it was a very, very different event. I think a lot of people viewed it as being outside the standard Dota 2 professional scene, and so I've chosen to eliminate it from these graphs, just for full disclosure. We have seen a few non-major super events. So the $500,000 tournaments that Valve is talking about that they want to match prize pool for, these already sort of exist, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail on the next slide. Some of them have been very, very good. So the 2 epicenters, both epicenter events, have been absolutely outstanding, both last year and this year, and those are around a $500,000 prize pool, right at Valve's threshold, as well as DAC 2017, which was truly a non-Valve event, just over a $600,000 prize pool. Some of these events have been not so good. So WCA 2015 was a bit of a disaster, saw a lot of controversy in terms of teams not getting paid. WCA 2016 was maybe a little bit better, but it still had its problems. It again had a relatively very large prize pool, upwards of $500,000, but some issues. WESG, as I talked about before, in terms of the lucrativeness of the event, very, very large prize pool, 1.5 million total, but a little bit alternative format, not really viewed as that serious a tournament by most of the people that followed the Dota 2 professional scene. More importantly, though, this is something you don't necessarily just get from looking at the number of events and the prize pool structure. The schedule has just been absolutely insane. And this, more than any single reason, is probably why I'm glad we're getting this major system and a little bit more clarity about how the scene's going to look moving forward. There were 3 $100,000 or more LAN events between TI6 and Boston. Only one of those, MDL 2016, actually occurred between TI6 and the Boston major invites being announced. And this is where you got a little bit of craziness that, Execration, for example, although they ended up not being able to make it to Boston due to visas, was actually invited to the Boston major based upon MPGL, which was a much lower profile tournament, was mostly SEA regional with a couple of Chinese teams. And that really kind of, it set a lot of us for a little bit of a spin in terms of understanding the way that those direct invites were working. There were 7 $100,000 or more events between Boston and Kiev, so you started to see a little bit more events flowing into the scene. The Kiev major invites were much better informed. We had a lot more data, so there were 6 events in that approximately 4-month period. But then we got the total explosion this last month, and there were actually as many LAN events held over a 30-day period just before TI invites were announced as there were over a 4-month period before the Kiev major. So the imbalance in the schedule was becoming really crazy. I mean, it was a great month. Everybody had a lot of fun watching all this Dota, but a lot of us were beginning to express concerns about, hey, TI is great, but it felt like these 6 LANs from May to June were all sort of pre-qualifiers or earn your direct invites, and then you had the massive TI qualifiers, and then TI, what's happening the other 40 or 50 weeks of the year. So this was a big concern, and I think the announcement today was mostly a step trying to stabilize and even out the schedule, make sure that we have high quality Dota being played throughout the year. All right, let's talk specifically about which events since TI6 would have qualified or could have qualified to be quote unquote majors. All right, so WCA is the first example. This is one I mentioned, had that over $500,000 prize pool. It did have international representation, so 3 Chinese, 2 SEA, EU, America qualifiers, plus 1 wildcard team that was kind of invited, I don't want to say last minute, but it was a little bit random. And again, this is one point that I'll look at. Nothing says you have to have at least 1 qualifier from all 6 regions. Nothing says that you have to have an equal representation. So you can break, provided you meet that one qualifier minimum, you can break things down in terms of both direct invites versus qualifier slots and regional representation, however you want. And I'm actually hopeful that this will happen. Now, this tournament had its problems. TNC ended up qualifying but not competing due to an incomplete roster. Wings was replaced sort of at the last minute in this tournament. There were a bunch of stand-ins that were used. And this is one of the big sort of advantages we don't know how much yet, but with this major prize matching system comes some degree of oversight by Valve. And it is important that when you read this blog post, all right, not every tournament that meets these prize pool thresholds is going to be a major or a minor, all right? Valve is going to step in and negotiate with the tournament organizers, make sure everything's up to par, make sure there's a system for getting teams paid before these kinds of prize pool matchings are going to occur. That's not spelled out in the announcement, but again, having worked with Valve, having worked with some of these tournament organizers, both good and bad, I can basically assure you of that. One tournament that wasn't talked about a lot, but that actually would have met the prize pool threshold if nothing else, was DPL Season 2. This was actually significant for a couple reasons. It had a very large prize pool, about $700,000. It was actually a Chinese-only league. And I don't think many people did, but if you actually watched the games from DPL Season 2, it was really excellent. If you look at the teams in terms of the quality of the competition, there were 6 teams that competed in the TI7 Chinese qualifiers, which were crazy competitive. Wings and Newbie and IG were also. So 9 out of the 10 teams had this consistent presence on the international stage afterwards, both competing in their region's qualifiers as well as the previous TI champion and 2 teams that were eventually directly invited to TI7. This was you can call it a regional only league. This was, in terms of statistical strength of field, a remarkably strong tournament. Now, it did have no LAN component, okay? It was round robin into bubble race with all matches played online. But I think as we go on and talk about the changes that I see or that I hope are coming, one of the big benefits is I don't think you have to have now all cookie cutter qualifiers into LAN or single or double elimination. I think that you're going to see a lot more variety in the types of tournaments that get planned and end up qualifying. And I think that that's a very good thing for a number of reasons that we'll discuss. DAC 2017, this is kind of the poster child for the type of tournament that I think Valve wants to turn into a major. 12 teams. There were 4 direct invites, 4 China qualifiers, and 1 each from the Americas, SEA, EU, and CIS. So really, you take 1 Chinese team away and split the Americas into North and South, and DAC was pretty much already there in terms of the requirements that Valve stated today. This was also significant in that this tournament was partially crowdfunded. So again, if you're not so, if you are familiar, but especially if you're not so familiar with the Dota 2 scene, one of the biggest changes that the major system has entailed over the past 2 years is that third-party tournaments have all but lost access to crowdfunding. It used to be that if you were a third-party tournament organizer, you could sell both a ticket and, perhaps more significantly, cosmetic items through the Dota 2 client and keep a portion of those profits as a way to help you monetize that event. That was very, very significant, particularly for some events like Captain's Draft, the Dota Cinema tournament that had absolutely sick Juggernaut sets, still one of the best Juggernaut sets in the game. That was a very important part for them in terms of being able to increase the prize pool and monetize the event for themselves. DAC was also one of the first events to kind of work around this issue that non-major tournaments are no longer be allowed compendiums. They had an online compendium, which sort of had mixed popularity with a lot of people, but it did have voting on the 1v1 championship that occurred at the actual event, and that championship was highly enjoyable. So this DAC, I think in retrospect, we're going to see this year's DAC as Valve, much as the original DAC was Valve's sort of pilot for the Valve run major. I actually think in many ways the most recent DAC is kind of the pilot for the new era of majors. And I think that that bodes very well. You talk about Epicenter 2017, and many of the same comments would have applied to the 2016 version. This was also very close. 5 invites, 4 qualifiers, 1 from the Americas, 1 from EU, including CIS, STA, and Chinese. Now, this wasn't crowdfunded, but it had absolutely stellar production value. Now, this is going to become important a little bit later in our talk. Epicenter, both in 2016 and 2017, rumor has it that this is a big organization that was willing to run these tournaments at a loss in exchange for establishing its place in the Dota 2 scene. So, keep in mind when you talk about Epicenter events, these 2 Epicenter events were amazing, okay? But at least based on some credible statements that I've heard, they didn't make any money. And that is one thing that we're eventually going to have to talk about, is whether these kinds of events can be economical, not only for Valve, the teams and the players, but also for the third-party tournament organizers that we're all sort of hoping are going to either jump in or jump back in this pool. The other thing is, how much flexibility is Valve really going to allow when these tournaments are designed? Navi got into the most recent epicenter in a little bit of a controversial last-minute public vote, all right, that was overwhelmingly in favor of Navi. Everybody that saw this public vote decision when it was released by the tournament kind of knew Navi was going to be the team that was voted in. It is a little bit of a question mark whether, if Valve is pitching in, are they going to allow things like this? That's one of the questions that I think needs to be answered going forward. All right, as far as the minors, and when we talk about these events as minors, I think the hope is not only are we going to get events of this quality for our quote-unquote minors, but that because they're no longer going to be competing with Valve run events that are $3 million or more, that these are some of the events that might grow into maybe knocking on the door that major threshold. These are the kinds of organizers, or many of them are the kind of organizers that we want running these top quality events in the space. You look at MDL. This ended up, as we mentioned before, being the only event between the TI6 and Boston Invites. It was 10 teams, $250,000. And this is something, I bolded this because it's something that I hope to really see. There were 4 direct invites. 2 of the invites to MDL, which was mostly a Chinese tournament, ended up being based upon season 1 of DPL. We talked about season 2 of DPL on a previous slide. Season 1 of the Dota 2 Pro League in China fed into MDL. This is something that I hope will continue when you talk about these majors and minors. One of the things that Dota 2 has really been missing over the last 2 years is league play, okay? Especially in the West. It was actually the case in China until this year, when with DPL came the top Chinese teams playing each other regularly. And as we'll talk about, I think that actually directly resulted in the Chinese teams becoming much more competitive as the season between TI6 and TI7 went on. But one of the things I tweeted about earlier in the year, with DPL season 1 and 2, as well as H Cup in China, you started to see the top tier Chinese teams play each other outside of the big lands. You still don't see that for Western teams, okay? EG and DC almost never play each other outside of lands, all right? EG and NP, when do they play outside of big lands? We never get to see that. We used to saw, how far have we come in a couple short years? 3 or 4 years ago, we were all worried about oversaturation. I always thought that was stupid, that, Navi and Alliance might be playing each other too often. So what? They were sick games. We're almost never getting to see tier 1 teams play each other online anymore. It's all only at these big events, and most of the time, you see it only maybe 3 or 4 times over the period of a couple months in between majors. That's just, it's not great. I've said this before. All right, I compared this with there was the Shanghai Major last year, and there was a CS:GO Major that occurred at right around the same point. All right, right around the same point in time. They were within a week of each other. That CS:GO Major, the top 8 teams at that event, I think it was 6 out of 8 of them were in action in multiple online matches within 10 days after the event ended. Those teams were already playing each other. They were already onto their league play. After the Shanghai Major, by contrast, 5 out of the 8 teams from the Shanghai Major did not play a single official match for 6 weeks after the event. All right, the top teams, there's no activity anymore. And that's very, very bad, because the way that you pull fans into your scene is that fans see Secret win the Shanghai Major, or they see Ad Finum reach the grand finals of the Boston Major. They want to see that team playing against other top quality competitions right away. They say, hey, I'm a fan. I want to see more of this team. All right, you wait 2 months until that team plays a meaningful game again or more. those fans lose interest. And a lot of the potential for drawing people in is really lost. So I actually hope to see more league play. The fact that there have to be qualifiers and representations for each region doesn't mean they all have to run the same. You could very easily have a Chinese tournament or a European tournament where most of the invites are based on regional leagues, and then you have a few qualifiers run in other leagues. We've already have, for example, StarLadder and iLeague are already partnered. StarLadder and Imba TV are partnered producing events in Russia and China. There's the possibility you could even have parallel leagues that all feed into this tournament with maybe a couple of standard single or double elim regional qualifiers to balance out the field per Valve requirements. China Top 2016. This was actually a very big tournament, over $200,000. There were only four teams all invited, e.g. Newbie, DC, and Wings. This is the kind of event that I kind of hope we move away from. It's great, all right? This is basically a series of show matches, but this is the kind of event that I think a lot of us were worried about, that basically you were seeing, as we discussed, the top teams were barely playing outside of the majors, and this was basically an effort to get the top Western teams to come over to China to face off, okay, against the top Chinese teams as kind of a barometer. This was something, again, when we talk about the merits of league play, something I wanted to point out is when you look at the evolution, okay, of Chinese teams over the season from TI6 to TI7 at MDL 2016, which was right after TI6. The four invites, three of them, one was NA, EG, two were EU, OG and Secret, and then you had MVP Phoenix. Those were actually the top four teams. This was a big warning bell for Chinese Dota that you had the four invited teams finish top four and the four Chinese teams at the event finished dead last. And indeed, if you went then to the Boston Major, 5 out of the bottom 8 teams at the Boston were Chinese teams. There was only one team from China that made it into the top 8 at Boston, and they finished 6th. So this is, this was a concern, and I think that was sort of a direct impetus where DPL Season 2 got organized, a lot of these other Chinese events got organized, the Chinese teams started to play each other regularly, and I think you saw a dramatic improvement in the quality of Chinese teams, not only just at the Kiev Major, but at other international LAN events since then as a direct result. ESL One Genting, again, ESL, a company that we desperately want involved in the Dota 2 scene. They are one of the big presences across all of esports. This was an 8-team, $250,000 tournament. I like it because, again, less than half of the field were direct invites. You had American, Chinese, and EU qualifiers, as long as one broad SEA. And this is something, again, when we highlight a little flexibility in tournament formats, I think it's great. When you talk about holding a tournament in the highlands of Malaysia, hey, you have a Malaysian specific qualifier. Just like for the Manila Masters, the next event we'll talk about, you had a Filipino specific qualifier. I actually think that that's, especially with these minor events, that's the kind of thing I want to see happen. This is where you pull those tier 2 teams in and they start to get to compete with some of the big boys for these big money LAN stages. The fact that you can ensure representation from all 6 regions, but then also have either league play or different kinds of qualifiers, country specific or specifically designed for tier 2 teams, also feed into these events. Okay. A big question again, the Genting, I loved this event, but it also sort of highlights some of the rut that we've gotten into and some of the problems in the major era. It's pretty clear Valve has sent the signal very strongly over the last couple of years that only LAN events matter for major invites, so they don't weigh online only play at all. The problem is we've sort of seen a coalescence in the structure of these tournaments. For most tournament organizers, without access to crowdfunding, really only one weekend lands are going to be viable. And so, Genting was a great event, but it was only a 3-day event. You had the GSL group stage. In fact, the first matches of the group stage, I believe, were even best of ones into single elimination bracket among the top 4 teams, best of 3 semis and best of 5 finals. It was a great finals between then Digital Chaos, now Planet Odd and Newbie. But again, these very shortened, compressed events have become the rule even among the tournaments we're talking about for minors. So a big question that we'll talk about at the end, I do think eventually we're going to have to address, will Valve share some of these costs besides just contributing to the prize pool? Because that was something that Valve has done extensively when you talk about the last 2 years of majors. It's not just the $3 million prize pool that Valve is contributing to, it's also the flights, the hotel costs, etc. That all plays into the viability of these events for third-party organizers. The Manila Masters, again, an example of a great event, and I thought one of the best things about Manila, look, I'll say this again probably later, we all love PGL. Like, PGL has done a freaking amazing job with the last couple of majors. They're going to do an amazing job with TI. 100%. Put it in the bank, okay? What about the next PGL? All right? There need to be other third-party organizers that have the chance to rise up. And Mineski, man, they hit it out of the park at Manila. I got to say, this was a tremendously enjoyable event to watch. I had a great time seeing both the panels, some of the additional content that they came up with, and I want to see more events like this where smaller organizers have a chance to sort of hit it out of the park, get up on that big stage, and even host qualifiers in their own countries. One of the other situations, though, when you talk about these invited teams, one of the rules is to be economically viable, you got to be competing for those top teams, those EGs, those OGs, okay? One of the devices that some of these mid-tier tournaments have been using to do that is we've seen prize pool allocations get steeper and steeper. So the way that you attract an EG to this tournament is that you say, well, okay, or a DC at this time after they had finished so well at the Boston Major, the way that you attract a team of that quality to this tournament is you say, well, okay, it's only $250,000, but first place takes home 50% of the prize pool. So if you guys are really that good, you're going to come in, you're going to make a lot of money. I think that's one of the big sort of things that I hope that Valve will change in this upcoming system. I hope to see, I thought it was ridiculous that 44% of the TI6 prize pool went to first place. I want to see a more even distribution where first prize takes home more like 30% of the total prize pool. And I think that some of this cost sharing could potentially help that a lot. All right. And the other thing is, by the way, knowing that there are qualifying points attached to these events, it helps both the storyline and it helps you attract the big name teams to more of these events. Presumably your EGs, your OGs are going to be willing to play more of these events without that huge cut first place enticement, because they're going to know that that's going to pad some of their totals going into the next TI. All right, big benefits, huge here. Just simple clarity and transparency. Look, guys, I've had a lot of fun making all these major invites videos. I love the fact that I've called the last 14, all 8 out of 8, all right, to Kiev and 6 out of 6 to TI. But frankly, it's a little bit ridiculous that we had to do all that speculating. I think the teams have asked for it. The talent have asked for it. A lot of these organizers have asked for it because, let's face it, that's part of how they're going to sell their tournaments to the fans. When I'm going to Star Ladder in Shanghai, or when I'm going to Galaxy Battles, all right, I want to be able to sell to my audience, hey, this is going to affect those TI standings. The fact is, we never really knew that. Filler pick, all right? Knoxville and I don't have to argue anymore, okay? We want more clarity and transparency, all right? A more balanced schedule throughout the year. And in fact, Valve actually explicitly says in its blog post that they are going to help organize the structure of these events and avoid conflicts. And this is really this was one of the big points that I feel like I've been shouting at a brick wall for 2 years about the majors. You know, Valve tends to announce these majors like 3 months in advance, okay? Tournament organizers like ESL and MLG, they're planning 6 to 8 months or more in advance to get these venues, to plan around their other events in other esports. Yes, guys, it's not just about Dota 2. And if we want to be working with some of these big name tournament organizers, we have to have a scene where they're not worried about planning an event and then, oh crap, it's either conflicting with or it's not going to affect the invite situation for the major. That was one of the reasons that I brought up the schedule between TI6 and Boston, that there were actually a couple of events there that were really good, but that had no possibility of affecting the invite picture for the Boston major because they had to be announced before the qualifiers. And that I think is a huge benefit, that Valve is just opening things up for bids, and you're going to kind of look at the whole year at once. You're going to have traditional tournament organizers like ESL able to plan events again according to a sane schedule. I mean, it's no accident, guys, that really the only ESL events that are getting planned are Genting, which was in January when we were sure that the winter major was going to be over and we were sure that we were going to have plenty of time between then and the other major, which ended up being Kiev, invites getting announced. Because again, that's a big, the impact on the major or TI picture is a big way that these tournaments sell teams and sell storylines on their event. All right. It opens things up to new third-party bidders. So this was a big concern that a lot of us had going back when we're looking at things like E-League and Counter-Strike. When we're looking at, yes, okay, Blizzard is probably on crack with their $20 million thing, but when we're looking at the money that some of these traditional sports organizations are looking at pumping into games like Overwatch, a lot of us said, hey, you know, how is Dota going to be competitive in this environment? Well, you know, I didn't agree. There were a couple of pretty bad articles I felt that came out with these like doom and gloom scenarios that I obviously didn't agree with, but it was a big concern, okay? And so we talked earlier about, hey, we want the next PGL, maybe that's already Mineski, to be able to step forward. We also want NBC Sports, Turner, heck, maybe even ESPN to be able to jump in, throw their hats in the ring, and possibly bid on an event that's maybe a little bit different. Maybe it is a league structure, okay, culminating in a LAN finals. Maybe the prize pool is even bigger than $500,000. But the point is, they can now step in, put in a bid well in advance, look at the schedule throughout the year, and they don't have to worry that everything is just going to be a mess and run into each other, all right? And again, kind of dovetailing onto that, majors and minors don't all have to be these cookie cutter weekend LANs. Guys, you know, I've worked plenty of these 3 or 4 day events. They're a lot of fun, but I feel like particularly in the last 30 days, we've kind of seen the same type of event over and over again. I really do hope that when we're talking about an 8-team minor, that we get the top 3 from a regional league plus one qualifier from each of the other 5 regions, for example. All right. Or maybe even 4 directly invited teams on top of that. Okay, that's one big gap in Valve's blog entry for today. We don't know whether these qualifying points are going to play a role in determining other event invites throughout the year and not just TI. I actually think it would be neat if they did, but again, we'll have to wait on that. That system is yet to be fully revealed. And it, again, I really want to stress, I think league play, I've felt this for a long time, is something that we badly need in Dota, particularly Western Dota. You look at how far the Chinese scene has come. It was a disaster at MDL. It was a disaster at Boston. It is no accident that a team like IG got itself together, played over 150 official matches since the release of 7.0, by far the most games between the announcement of 7.0 and the Kiev Major and afterward, and they're the team that has risen the most over that period. I know people say they've fallen off a little bit recently, but look at Kiev, guys, all right? I think that's been a huge influencer in terms of that region coming back. I think that's a huge influencer when you talk about the rise of a lot of young talent from that region, and the fact that particularly when you look at the Chinese teams, a lot of the big names are missing TI this year, but a lot of the younger talent is going to get their opportunity. And there are a lot of teams, even with some of the new guys like Afu, I think is a guy that I'm going to talk about a lot, all right, for LGDFY as we do our team previews for TI. But we talk about Ehome Keen, who barely missed out. Like, a lot of young talent rising up in these regions. And I think it's indeed with league play, it also becomes a lot more possible that we're going to see high quality online matches again. I miss being able to open up Twitch one day and just randomly see Navi and Alliance playing. I think this makes it more likely that we're going to see a bit more movement back toward that era. All right, the big questions. Crowdfunding. This slide could basically say crowdfunding, crowdfunding, crowdfunding. This is the big question, all right? Over the last 2 years, I never wanted to be this blunt about it, but my big concern is that Valve's model felt to me like it was becoming more extractive. That it was like, okay, we're going to make our money 3 or 4 times a year selling compendiums from the majors and TI, and then the other weeks of the year, you guys are pretty much on your own, okay? The big question in my mind is, will third-party majors and minors get in-game items and compendiums again? Are we going to have crowdfunding access? Will crowdfunded dollars count, either raised or projected, toward the $150,000 or the $500,000 goals? That's going to have a lot to do with the viability of some of these smaller tournament organizers as they try to get to that $150K or $500K cutoff value. And something that is near and dear to my heart, and something we've asked a lot of questions about recently: does this restore opportunities for or mean better treatment of workshop artists? Workshop artists, yes, some of the best ones have been hired by Valve, and they're excellent people, but there are a lot of incredibly talented people out there that have produced in the past and are still just dying to produce top quality content for Dota 2 that aren't necessarily getting fair compensation, or that have stopped producing items entirely. We want those people in the scene, okay? The Anuxis are here to stay, and thank God for that. But we want the next generation of artists. These people are a huge part of our community that deserve fair compensation, that deserve recognition, that deserve opportunity. Cost sharing. This is, again, as an economist, one of my bigger concerns. So is Valve going to share any costs outside of their contribution to the prize pool? Believe it or not, guys, team flights, venue costs, those are a big deal when you talk about the economic viability of events, all right? What about qualifiers? Is Valve going to provide any assistance with running these qualifiers? That it stipulates, all right? How are these events going to be monetized? LD and others recently have said they want to see non-Valve events get promoted with streams and client. They want those client views going toward their Twitch numbers, as well as just people tuning in through the internet. This is a very big deal. Again, store specials in client, feeding into this access to crowdfunding question. Are we going to see tournament items and compendiums get promoted again for these individual tournaments? All right, the bottom line, guys, is, epicenters have been amazing, all right? But most third-party tournament organizers in esports are not going to do a $500,000 event if it's not profitable, okay? People have wondered why MLG turned away a little bit from Dota, well, completely from Dota 2. Why ESL is hosting fewer Dota 2 events and more events in other esports. And guys, the answer is because between the risk associated with scheduling and organizing these events, no access to crowdfunding, limited monetization options. Valve can monetize exclusively by selling compendiums and in-game hats, okay? If you are a tournament organizer other than Valve, your sponsors care about stream views. You can't just say, well, only the LAN game matters, okay? Your viewer numbers on Twitch, when you talk about sponsors that have presences in other esports, organizations that are funding these tournaments, not just the tournament organizers, they care about publicity, about stream views, about promotional opportunities within the game client. Is Valve going to open those features back up? How's the monetization model going to work? We will probably see at least one more video in this series talking in more depth about that when this is released. Is there going to be support for events like the Summit and or alternate formats like Dota Cinema's Captain Draft to possibly step up and become minors? Is Valve going to be willing to work with these events that aren't structured maybe like traditional LANs and help them fit into this major structure? It's tremendously important. We don't want the same event over and over again, and we want to be able to fit the tournament organizers that have had a consistent and an excellent presence within our scene, like Beyond the Summit and like Dota Cinema. We want to be able to fit them into this system, okay, and not lock them out. The point system, a lot of questions associated with this. I think accruing points to players, it sounds like a very good idea on paper. It can be a good idea in practice if executed well. There are a lot of questions that surround it. The big one, can a team win a major in December, take the rest of the season off? Effectively, this has arguably been what a lot of the Tier 1 Western teams are flirting with doing anyway, all right? Presumably, this is why point values increase as you go on in the season, as stipulated in Valve's post, but you don't want to have this situation where, the game show situation where here's the lightning round, round 3, and the point values are such that rounds 1 and 2 were completely meaningless. So you can't rely on just that steepening, that ramping up toward the end of the season, or it just makes events early in the season feel like they don't matter at all. And again, a big Valve, we've talked in some of these videos before about how Valve, relative to other esports, relative to other developers, does not officially recognize the role of organizations in the Dota 2 scene. There's a big question in my mind, is an organization going to be able to buy its way to TI by, say, late in the season, poaching 3 players off a roster? There are various things you can do, including a manipulation of the roster lock dates to prevent that, of course, but it is an issue that bears some scrutiny and that I do think that we're going to have to confront. I eventually think that we are going to have to recognize the role of teams and organizations, not just individual players, but that's a topic for another video. So some closing thoughts that I'll give to you, all right? In my opinion, this is extraordinarily promising, all right? But today's post conveys the spirit, not the letter of the law. Don't make too many assumptions here, all right? I'm kind of trying to lay out possibilities, give you some of my thoughts going forward, but I already see a lot of people assuming a lot of things about how these majors and minors are going to work. Please be careful with that, all right? Valve, if we've seen anything else in the last few years, they believe in iteration, they believe in experimentation, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but don't assume that it is all spelled out from that post today. A big thing, we had all asked for a system like this, particularly a minor system, all right, with Valve potentially involved in some smaller tournaments. Out of a desire rather to help these second and third tier teams. I actually think whether or not this is a boon to the second and third tier scenes, and boy, when I say this, I'm looking at EU in particular. Like, you look at a couple years ago, right? The Western tier 2 scene looked like it was thriving, and China was facing all these questions about, well, where's the next generation of great Chinese players going to come from? Now you look at the state of EU Dota, you look at the state of the EU TI7 qualifiers compared to China, it's not even close, okay? I really do worry about that. I think that one of my favorite things about this announcement is the potential to really step in and help create an environment that's going to be conducive to more second and third tier teams growing into their place on the pro scene. But again, it's all about flexibility. I want to see league play accommodated. I want to see third-party tournaments be able to monetize and plan creatively so that they can get ways to make sure that some of these smaller teams have the opportunities to compete, but still attract the top teams and still attract those big sponsor dollars that we need to keep bringing into the scene. The overarching question, how much control does Valve cede? All right, ostensibly, Valve is going to have a much less direct role in planning these events when you're talking about majors and minors now when you compare it to the last 2 years. It's a tricky thing. I know for a fact there were several large prominent tournament organizers that put in bids for previous Valve run events, including perhaps TI, and pretty much a short way through the process said, hey, look, we've been running esports events. We've been putting these on for years. We kind of know what we're doing, and they're stepping in and they're trying to tell us a little bit too much about how to run our show. A lot of the reason I do believe, as much credit as PGL deserves, and nobody's a bigger fan of them than me, a lot of the reason that PGL has been so effective is that they are a very smaller, very nimble organization. They're better able to plan these events and adapt to some of the control that Valve tends to exert. That control is going to have to get smaller over time. I think that's fine, all right, but it is going to be something that I'm going to be keeping an eye on going forward, all right? And again, the biggest single thing that I really hope comes out of this, in addition to crowdfunding being back for third-party tournaments, Tier 2 and 3 teams getting some more opportunities on these big stages, I really hope that eventually, sooner rather than later, that we're going to see a third tier of tournaments, that we're going to see LAN qualifiers supported by Valve for these major events, and most particularly TI. When I look at the quality of teams in these regions, I think it's great that we finally got to 6 regions so that these ping issues are minimized. But when I look at, the difference between a team like DC or the heartbreak for a team like Team Freedom, all right, that played their asses off throughout those NA quals and missed by the thinnest of margins going to TA. You think about how heartbroken Clutch Gamers are right now, how heartbroken eHome Keen has to feel. These teams, when you're talking about $20 million potentially at a TI, they deserve to be able to compete on LAN. And I think once you have these events more populated throughout the year, once you have more support, better infrastructure for smaller LANs, LAN qualifiers for TI8 become possible. I really hope we see them. Thanks a lot, you guys. I know this has been an extended video, but I had a lot on my mind as far as this. I am very optimistic for our scene going forward. I think that this is the first step in the next great golden age for Dota 2. This is Nahaz. Thanks for listening. I will talk to you soon.